Here is the paradox that almost no one in mainstream coverage will say out loud. The two countries most invested in making sure this week's nuclear talks fail are not Iran and the United States. They are Israel and Saudi Arabia. Think about what that means. While U.S. and Iranian negotiators sit across a table in Muscat trying to find common ground on uranium enrichment caps, two American allies, one a declared regional military power, the other the world's swing oil producer, are quietly working to ensure that no deal gets done. Not because a nuclear Iran serves their interests, but because a sanctioned, isolated, economically strangled Iran serves them even better. What you are about to hear is not the story of a rogue state defying the international community. It is the story of a sovereign country defending the one program that keeps it relevant in a region where relevance is measured in deterrence, and of the inherited poisoned legacy that makes any agreement between Washington and Tehran nearly impossible to sustain. I have spent years reconstructing how Middle Eastern security architecture actually functions, not as it is presented in press briefings, but as it operates through back channels, proxy networks, and bilateral relationships that rarely make the front page. What I found consistently is that the loudest voices demanding Iranian compliance are almost never the ones who would bear the consequences of regional escalation. The people who would bear those consequences rarely get a microphone. Tonight, I want to give them one. One sentence. Iran's nuclear program is a sovereign right being weaponized by external actors, primarily Israel and Saudi Arabia, who have a documented strategic interest in keeping Iran weak, isolated, and permanently under Western pressure, regardless of what Tehran actually does at the negotiating table. To understand where we are, you need to go back to 1953. That year, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, because he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company. That is not conspiracy theory. That is documented, declassified history, acknowledged by the CIA itself in 2013. What was installed in Mossadegh's place was the Shah, a monarch who ran a brutal security apparatus, Savak, that tortured and disappeared political opponents for 26 years with full Western support. When the 1979 revolution came, it was not born from nowhere. It was the accumulated inheritance of a poisoned relationship, a country that had watched its democratic experiment strangled by outside powers and replaced with a compliant autocrat. That inheritance is still in the room every time U.S. and Iranian negotiators sit down. Iranians across the political spectrum, not just hardliners but reformists and technocrats, remember 1953. That memory is not paranoia. It is institutional learning. And it is the reason why a 20-year freeze proposal, offered by the same country that engineered the 1953 coup and walked away from the 2015 agreement, lands very differently in Tehran than it does in Washington. Now let us follow the incentive structure. Who actually benefits when Iran remains under maximum pressure? Start with Israel. A sanctioned Iran cannot freely fund Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, or the Houthi movement in Yemen, at least not without friction. Every dollar of sanctions pressure on Tehran is a dollar of indirect pressure on Israel's adversary network. Israeli officials have said publicly and repeatedly that they oppose any nuclear deal that does not permanently dismantle Iran's enrichment capacity. Not cap it, not freeze it, dismantle it. That position is not a negotiating posture, it is a veto. And Washington has historically been reluctant to move forward on any Iran framework over sustained Israeli objection. Now look at Saudi Arabia. For decades, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry has been the organizing axis of Middle Eastern geopolitics, Sunni versus Shia, Arab versus Persian, Riyadh versus Tehran. A nuclear-capable Iran upsets Saudi Arabia's regional dominance in ways that no amount of F-35 purchases can fully compensate for. The 2023 Chinese-brokered Saudi-Iranian normalization agreement was a diplomatic surprise precisely because it temporarily disrupted this dynamic. But normalization of diplomatic relations is not the same as strategic reconciliation. Saudi Arabia's interest in keeping Iran economically suppressed runs much deeper than any handshake in Beijing.
According to analysis from the Brookings Institution and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the lobbying infrastructure that shapes U.S.-Iran policy, think tanks, congressional relationships, intelligence sharing arrangements, has significant overlap with Israeli and Gulf state interests. This is not nefarious. It is how foreign policy works. But it means that U.S.-Iran negotiations are never purely bilateral. There are always additional parties at the table who are not in the room.
Here is what the Non-Proliferation Treaty actually says. Under Article 4, every signatory has what the treaty calls an inalienable right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Iran signed the NPT. Iran has submitted to IAEA inspection regimes, more extensively, in fact, than many other NPT signatories. The enrichment program that Washington is demanding be frozen for 20 years is, under international law, a legal activity. Now compare that to the countries in Iran's neighborhood that are not subject to the same pressure. Israel has never signed the NPT and is widely understood to possess between 80 and 90 nuclear warheads, according to estimates from the Federation of American Scientists. It has faced no sanctions, no international inspection regime, and no 20-year freeze proposals.
India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed, neither NPT signatories, were eventually integrated into global nuclear commerce through special agreements. The standard applied to Iran is not universal. It is selective. And Iranians across the political spectrum understand exactly what that selectivity signals.
Sanctions are often described as pressure tools. What they are, in practice, is an economic siege. The IMF has documented that Iran's GDP contracted sharply following the reimposition of U.S. sanctions in 2018. Inflation has averaged above 35% annually for the past 5 years. The Iranian middle class, educated, urban, internationally connected, has been systematically impoverished by a policy instrument aimed at their government but landing on their savings accounts. Think of it this way. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding that your country's access to the international banking system has been cut off. You cannot receive wire transfers. Your employer cannot pay international suppliers. The company you work for cannot export its products. That is not a hypothetical for millions of Iranians.
That has been their economic reality for years. And yet Iranian public opinion, even among those most critical of their own government, consistently shows resistance to the idea that external coercion should determine their country's sovereign choices.
There is a reason talks are potentially resuming in Muscat this week, and it has as much to do with American domestic pressure as Iranian flexibility. With oil markets volatile and a U.S. election cycle approaching, the White House has economic incentives to show diplomatic progress. Iranian officials have reportedly signaled willingness to discuss enrichment caps, not a freeze, but a ceiling, in exchange for the lifting of specific secondary sanctions that affect the pharmaceutical and food sectors. But here is the structural problem. Even if negotiators in Muscat reach a framework, the path to ratification in the United States requires Senate approval for a treaty, a threshold that current political dynamics make nearly impossible. What is achievable is an executive agreement, like the original JCPOA.
Size, and Iran's core demand, learned from bitter experience, is that any agreement be durable enough to survive a change of administration. Washington cannot currently offer that guarantee, and both sides know it.
Meanwhile, the regional architecture is shifting in ways that complicate any bilateral deal. The Abraham Accords normalized Israeli relations with Gulf states. China brokered the Saudi-Iranian dialogue. Russia has deepened military cooperation with Tehran. The old bipolar frame, America's allies versus Iran's proxies, no longer maps cleanly onto the actual relationships on the ground. For Iran, this shifting landscape is actually a source of leverage. A decade ago, Iran was more isolated. Today, it has functioning economic relationships with China, military supply lines from Russia, and a network of non-state partners across the region. The pressure that was supposed to force capitulation has instead accelerated Iran's pivot toward alternative partnerships. This is the unintended consequence that the 20-year freeze proposal does nothing to address. Iran faces a genuine strategic choice right now, with 3 real options. The first, accept a modified version of the freeze, take economic relief, and bet that the next U.S. administration honors what this one signs. The economic benefit is immediate and real. The political risk, another JCPOA collapse, is historically documented. The second, hold firm on full sovereignty, continue enrichment, and force the international community to either accept a near-nuclear Iran or escalate militarily. The leverage is maximized. The cost could be devastating, both for Iran and for regional stability. The third, and the one Tehran has been quietly advocating, is a comprehensive regional security dialogue that includes all major stakeholders: Russia, China, Gulf states, and the European powers. One that addresses not just enrichment levels, but the entire security architecture that makes an Iranian bomb seem necessary to Iran in the first place.
Option 3 is the only one that resolves the underlying dynamic rather than deferring it. It is also the one that Israel and Saudi Arabia have the most interest in preventing, because it would require acknowledging Iran as a legitimate regional power rather than a problem to be managed.
Scenario 1. A limited executive agreement is reached. Iran caps enrichment below weapons grade. The U.S. lifts targeted sanctions. Both sides present this as a win. Israel publicly objects. Saudi Arabia quietly accommodates. The underlying sovereignty question is deferred for another administration to inherit. Scenario 2. Talks collapse. The window for Israeli military action, which Israeli officials have indicated closes as Iranian enrichment approaches certain thresholds, narrows. Strikes occur, likely on Fordo and Natanz. Iran retaliates through proxies and by closing the Strait of Hormuz temporarily. Oil prices spike above $120 a barrel. A global economy already under inflationary pressure absorbs a shock that hits ordinary households in every importing country.
Scenario 3. A comprehensive regional framework emerges, unlikely in this political environment, but not structurally impossible. It would require American willingness to engage Russia and China as co-architects of a regional security order, and Israeli and Saudi willingness to accept a legitimate Iranian role. Every one of those conditions faces massive domestic political resistance. Scenario 4. Prolonged controlled ambiguity. Iran maintains enrichment just below weapons grade, preserving deterrence without triggering military response. The United States maintains pressure without crossing into open conflict. Israel conducts periodic covert operations. Saudi Arabia quietly diversifies its security partnerships. This is the most likely scenario, and its costs are diffuse, slow-moving, and therefore invisible until they are not.
If you are an informed adult watching this, you are probably frustrated by coverage that reduces a complex sovereignty dispute to a simple story of a dangerous rogue state and a patient superpower. The forensic record does not support that framing. What it does support is this: a country with a documented history of foreign intervention in its affairs, exercising a legal right under international treaty, is being asked to permanently surrender that right, not primarily because the United States fears an Iranian bomb, but because two U.S. allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have structural interests in keeping Iran weak. That is not anti-American analysis. It is a straightforward reading of documented incentive structures. The clarity that matters here is not about who is good and who is bad.
It is about understanding why, after decades of negotiations, frameworks, agreements, and collapses, the core dynamic never actually resolves. It does not resolve because the parties with the most to gain from resolution are not the ones setting the terms.
Let me pull this together. Iran rejected the 20-year freeze proposal. Coverage framed this as Iranian aggression. The forensic record suggests something more precise: a sovereign country declining to permanently surrender the one program that gives it deterrence value in a region where deterrence is the primary currency, and doing so against the backdrop of a 70-year history of foreign interference that includes a CIA-backed coup, a brutal U.S.-supported dictator, and a broken international agreement that Washington itself abandoned. The two actors most invested in ensuring no deal is reached, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are not in the room in Muscat, but their influence is. It runs through congressional relationships, intelligence-sharing frameworks, think tank networks, and the quiet but firm message that any agreement that legitimizes Iranian enrichment, even at low levels, is unacceptable.
The poisoned inheritance of 1953 compounds annually. Every broken agreement, every assassinated scientist, every family whose savings evaporate under sanction pressure adds interest to a bill that never quite comes due, but also never goes away. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If Iran's nuclear program is legal under international treaty, and the countries applying maximum pressure have their own undisclosed nuclear arsenals or documented strategic interests in Iranian weakness, what would a genuinely fair negotiated outcome actually look like? Leave your answer in the comments. The most substantive ones I will read in the follow-up.